This video is solving quadratic equations and it's part 2. So in the last video, we looked at the most basic kind of quadratic equation and we talked about the fact that a quadratic equation will be an equation. So it's got to have a left-hand side, it's got to have a right-hand side, but also in a quadratic equation, the highest power of the pronumeral, so that letter in the equation, its highest power has to be 2. And so we looked at some really basic examples where, for example, n squared equals 16. So it's saying some number squared equals 16. And we talked about the fact that you could square 4 to get 16, but you could also square negative 4. So the interesting thing is these quadratic equations will have 2 solutions, which is quite different because with the linear equations we've looked at, we only ever get one solution. So that's where we got up to with solving quadratic equations. I want to now go a little bit further with looking at quadratic equations, and I'm giving you another quadratic equation. Here it is, and it says some number squared equals minus 25. So I want you to spend a little bit of time right now thinking about what number can I square and that gives me the result minus 25. That's your challenge. Your brain might be thinking, oh, well, that's a little tricky actually, and I might be having trouble to think of that number, and hopefully that is the case because that is a tricky question. So whenever we square a number, so if I take the number 7 and I square it, I get 49. If I take the number minus 3 and I square it, I get positive 9. I hope you notice that it doesn't matter whether I take a positive number and square it or if I take a negative number and square it, the result is always positive. Okay? So then how can I take a number and square it and get a negative number? And that's why for this particular kind of equation, whenever we will say that this equation has no real solution. So whenever we square a number, the result is always a positive number. So if you get x squared equals minus 25, it means that really we are not able to write a solution for this equation. The word real just means a number that I can find somewhere on a number line. So there is no number that I can find on the number line where when I square it, I will get minus 25. There actually is a number. It's actually called a complex number, but at this point of year 8, we're not really going to get into complex numbers. So for now, our response will be that there is no real solution, no solution that I can find on the number line that I can square that number and I'll get minus 25. So there are no numbers at the moment that you can square to get minus 25. So what should you know? For quadratic equations of this form, and this is the form that you're most likely to see in year 8. So for example, x squared equals 100, or x squared equals 11, or maybe you'll see something more complex like 4m squared equals 16. That's the kind of equations you will see in year 8, and these equations will have 2 solutions. So for example, if I have y squared equals 36, the number I square to get 36 is 6 or minus 6. And the biggest error students make is to forget about the minus 6. For quadratic equations of the form x squared equals c, where c is negative, this is like the example we looked at before. For example, x squared equals minus 4. These equations will have no real solution. It means there is no number that I can square, no real number that I can square that will give me minus 4. So if you get a question like this, what you would write down as your solution is no real solution. So to something like this question over here. So how can we extend this a little bit further? Well, in year 8, you are required to be able to solve an quadratic equation, but sometimes we're going to get 3 different types of answers. The first one we've already looked at, where your answer is an integer. So some number squared equals 9. Well, straight away I now know that number is plus or minus 3. So 2 solutions. Sometimes when I think of a number that I have to square to get 8, I can't think of a nice whole integer, and that might mean that your answer is a surd. So if I'm trying to work out what do I square to get 8, to get rid of this squared, think about Pythagoras' theorem. To remove a squared, we could just take the square root. And so what that means is if I square the number square root of 8, I will get 8. You can even check this in your calculator. You can put the square root of 8 into your calculator, square it for me. And when you square it, I'm hoping if you enter it correctly, it should give you 8. So it turns out this number, which is called a surd, which we've learnt about already this year, a surd That's just a number that cannot be written as a fraction. And you might think, oh, well, I can write it as a fraction. I can write it as root 8 over 1. That's not what I mean. When I say write it as a fraction, you need to write it as some integer over another integer, and I can't do that with root 8. So for questions where we can't think of a nice whole integer, the solution will be a surd. So I'm going to write here d equals root 8, but hopefully you're yelling at me saying, wait a minute, you forgot the negative solution. And yes, I have. I've forgotten the plus and the minus because there are two solutions. If I square minus root 8, then that negative will turn into a positive and I will still get 8. So that will also satisfy this equation. The last kind of way we might ask you to express your solution is to round it, because a surd will become a decimal if I enter it into my calculator and evaluate it. So if we want to find what number do I square to get 20, well, I can take the square root again, just like before, and this is now in surd form. And if I'm asked to round my answer to 2 decimal places, you will have to go to your calculator and enter root 20. So I want you to pick up your calculator and enter root 20. Putting it into mine now. And when you press equals, you should get 4.4721. Now I've asked you to round that to only 2 decimal places, 4.4721, ... And so to 2 decimal places, that means I only need 2 numbers after the decimal place, and because that number 2 is smaller than 5, then I don't need to change the 7. So we're going to round this to 4.47. So let's put that down as my answer, 4.47. I'm going to put my plus and minus, and I'm also going to put in brackets 2 dp, so it is clear how I have rounded my answer. So 3 ways we can express our answer to a quadratic equation: as an integer, that's if your answer is a nice whole number. We can also express it as a surd if we are asked to leave it in surd form, and that is also called exact form because we have not rounded my answer. And then finally we've got a rounded answer, which is no longer exact, where you will round it according to however the question asks you. In this case we did it to 2 dp. All right, let's finish off with just another example, slightly harder than the most basic kind of quadratic equation, and that's where, so the most basic kind we looked at was something like x squared equals 100, but this one's a little bit more involved than that. So what we need to do is just move the terms that are not in the right place so that we are able to make m squared the subject. So I'll always move whatever's attached to the pronumeral last. So here I'm going to add 100, and then those will give me 0, so I'll get 5m squared equals 100. Then I can move the times by 5 by doing the inverse operation of dividing by 5, and I'll get m squared equals, well, 100 divided by 5, well, that's 20, and then I can get rid of the squared by taking the square root, and I must remember my plus and minus. So if the question says to leave my answer in surd form or in exact form, then this is where I can stop. If the question asks me to round, then I need to put the root 20 into my calculator, and this is actually just the answer that we got before, the decimal that we rounded, which was 4.47, so I might express it as plus or minus 4.47. Make sure you know where to end your question, because if you do not know and it says leave it in surd form and you go and round it, well, that will be incorrect. Okay, and if it says to round your answer to 2 decimal places and you go and leave it as a surd, well, then that will be incorrect as well. So you must follow the instructions in the question.